The Sinaloa drug cartel was once the world's largest drug cartel. However, in recent years, civil war has split the cartel into two separate warring factions fighting for control of the empire. Meanwhile, its rivals ate away at the fringes, desperate to use the chaos to enhance their own positions. Still though, the Sinaloa Cartel is a beast and it won't be easy to dismantle. We're going to do an in-depth assessment of the Sinaloa Cartel using the same framework that we have been using in the past several videos, that is the PMES-EPT framework. And again, we're going to be reordering things just a little bit for the purposes of this video. We're going to be front-loading the physical and time dimensions because they provide some very important context for the rest. Like with my Mexico video, which a lot of people really liked, this will be designed to give you just a general understanding of how exactly the Sinaloa drug cartel works, what they've been doing and what they're currently doing, as well as what might be in store for their future. Everything from some of the people involved and their capabilities to how they operate to the history of what lays ahead. We've got a lot to dig into, so let's get right in. Starting with the physical layer, and I'm going to be using the active cartels map, courtesy of @MexicoControlMap on X. It's free to use, but definitely give him some support over on PayPal. This has been an incredible resource for folks like me who have been trying to cover this or catch up on what's going on. Here we can see that the Sinaloa drug cartel has or had control of very large swaths of northern and central Mexico, as well as still large swaths of southern Mexico. Large portions of this territory, however, either has recently been or is currently in the process of being captured by other rival groups. It's also important to note early that as of right now, I'm calling all of this the Sinaloa drug cartel. What I'm really referring to is both sides that are currently warring against each other, and we're going to dive into why exactly they're doing that in a moment. But just as some shorthand, just to establish a definition, whenever I refer to the Sinaloa drug cartel, I'm referring to both the La Misa faction and the Los Chapitos faction. In the north, the Sinaloa drug cartel controls a couple small pockets of territory along the U.S. border. It's important because it grants the Sinaloa cartel the ability to move product as well as migrants across the border themselves without having to worry about any kind of partnership with a rival group. However, those areas of control are small and they're beginning to shrink. For example, across the border from Texas and the state of Chihuahua, Sinaloa has been fighting out against the Juarez cartel in La Lina, which is the Juarez cartel's heavily armed and angry faction that controls basically the military side of things. And they're in control of the border region. Further west, of course, you have the border of California, and the Sinaloa cartel still has access to the U.S. border there, leading them directly into San Diego from Tijuana, as well as east towards Calexico. Geographically, these areas are all much drier and more mountainous, especially towards the west in California, and much flatter and more arid in the east towards the Texas side. Both are more or less like deserts either way in terms of climate. Further south, however, the Sinaloa cartel is really spread out with few connecting parts. They're also located and have territory in southern Baja California, but they predominantly are located in the central and northern end of central Mexico, covering large swaths of land across Sinaloa, Durango, and Zacatecas. These areas are also fairly rugged and mountainous, with the Mexican plateau splitting the Sierra Madre Mountains. We've already done a more in-depth assessment of the Mexican geography in that Mexican overview video, so if you want to take a look at that, that will kind of give you a good introduction, a high-level introduction before getting into this. Finally, the Sinaloa cartel also heavily is involved in the Yucatan Peninsula to the southeast. This area is much lower elevation, more humid and jungly. And this is all just their areas of control within Mexico. However, they are still known to operate far beyond Mexico, with activity registered as far as Latin America, the Caribbean, Canada, East Asia, Europe, and of course, very heavily in the United States. Moving now to the time dimension, we'll cover here how the cartel obviously spans multiple time zones, but we'll also see how they're spread out across multiple areas, and that can extend travel time, especially whenever moving product or personnel across areas of control. For example, if they wanted to move some product that was produced in central Mexico into California, it would take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours of a flight depending on the aircraft. However, if they wanted to keep a low profile and move by boat, which they often do all of these modes of transportation simultaneously anyway, then the travel time could be as high as 43 hours, but that's again dictated very heavily on the speed and destination that they're heading to. Now let's imagine, however, though, that they need to move some product or personnel from the Yucatan Peninsula to Baja California. Air is certainly one way that they can go about doing this, however, that would still take multiple hours and they would have to take a quick pit stop in central Mexico to refuel. Driving, however, is much cheaper cheaper and higher payload. However, it is also higher risk due to the longer duration and the longer distance. Of course, they're risking passing through rivals' territory, which could lead to checkpoints and other kinds of issues, not just with rivals, but also with the Mexican federal government. It would also take multiple days depending on the route. Now, that's just moving product from Mexico, but obviously the Sinaloa Cartel can move product further afield to places like the Philippines, as an example, where it can blend their shipments into the United States with other shipments coming from East Asia. Obviously, this does very vastly increase the travel time. However, the risk is reduced. So clearly, the Sinaloan Empire is quite large, and that has its costs and benefits. Now, with that, let's get to the juicy part in the political dimension. Historically, the Sinaloa drug cartel has frequently been in a state of conflict, mostly targeting rival factions and expanding its areas of control. Felix Gallardo united the Guadalajara cartel and really revolutionized the power dynamic within Mexico and beyond, leapfrogging Mexican cartels in terms of power over their Colombian rivals. Following his arrest in 1989, the Sinaloa Cartel emerged as the largest faction of this organization, led by his lieutenant Hector Luis Palma Salazar, Juan Jose Esparragoza, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The Sinaloa Cartel clashed heavily with the Tijuana Cartel throughout the 90s, ultimately absorbing most of it through alliances and agreements. During that conflict, El Chapo brought Ismael Zambada Garcia, nicknamed El Mayo, into the business. El Mayo was highly skilled in working with other traffickers, and he quickly made a name for himself within the Sinaloa cartel. While El Chapo and Palma Salazar were in jail, El Mayo took control of the Sinaloa cartel and really expanded things significantly. As the war between Sinaloa and Tijuana heated up, the Mexican government began to crack down, largely on the Tijuana cartel though, and this set El Mayo up to expand operations that was previously in the Tijuana cartel's territory. After the conflict ended, the Sinaloa cartel had more or less absorbed the Tijuana cartel. El Mayo had reportedly sent a helicopter to free and assist El Chapo from his prison in the Puente Grande prison. In 2005, the Beltran-Leyva brothers grew to be a threat against the Sinaloa cartel, especially near Arizona, before being taken down. In 2006, though, Sinaloa had control of nearly the entire U.S. border. That was roughly the high watermark in terms of power for the Sinaloa cartel, with it existing in a similar, if not slightly greater size and strength to the Medellin cartel at the height of Pablo Escobar's days. The money was flowing, but we all know the saying, more money, more problems. El Muñeco, the key lieutenant for El Chapo, was arrested in 2012. Chino Anthrax, another high-ranking member of the Sinaloa cartel, who was personally leading the protective group for El Mayo, was arrested in 2013 at the Amsterdam airport at the behest of the United States. In 2013, El Macho Prieto, another key lieutenant of El Chapo, was killed in a gunfight with the Mexican Federal Police in Sonora. With the walls closing in around El Chapo, it finally came to be his turn, with his arrest coming in 2014. He would successfully break out of prison a second time. However, he would again be arrested in 2016 and extradited to the United States. And this is whenever things begin to get pretty nasty for the Sinaloa cartel. After El Chapo's arrest, El Mayo took control of the cartel. However, reports emerged in 2020 that El Mayo had declining health as well as diabetes, and that El Chapo's sons were rising in influence and power internally. This created two separate factions within the Sinaloa cartel called La Mayiza, which were under El Mayo, and the Los Chapitos under El Chapo's sons. Things remained tense but relatively stable until very recently. In 2023, El Chapo's son Ovidio Guzman, who was believed to be the leader of Los Chapos at the time, was arrested and extradited to the United States. Then in 2024, El Mayo himself, along with another of El Chapo's sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, was arrested in the United States. What's juicy here, though, is that in court, in very recent statements, this court proceeding is still going on as of the recording of this video in February 2025. El Mayo alleged that he was kidnapped and wrongfully detained after Joaquin Guzman took him to El Paso, where they arranged the arrest with U.S. authorities. While the Guzman brothers deny this, they have been reportedly negotiating a plea deal with U.S. authorities, which to me indicates some level of cooperation. And this all almost immediately kicked off a massive civil war across the Sinaloan Empire between La Mayiza and Los Chapitos. And that's opened the door for larger and more powerful factions that rival the Sinaloa cartel, like CJNG, for example, to start taking over Sinaloa territory. So that's what's been going on with the Sinaloa cartel up to now. Obviously, that's pretty crazy, and that leaves a pretty obvious question of who exactly is in charge right now. Well, not really anybody technically. For this, I needed to reach out again to All Source News from Astorias Tech, and for those of you that watch the Mexico video, you're familiar that this is a subject matter expert, so he's a very reliable source, and if you're on Twitter, definitely give him a follow. Of course, you've got the two factions. You've got La Maíza and Los Chapitos. El Chapo's son, Ivan Guzman Salazar, is still in charge of Los Chapitos, while El Mayo's son, Maído Flaco, is in charge of La Maíza. However, it's unclear what levels of command and control either of these individuals have, and how that has been delegated to lower level or mid-level lieutenants, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that, of course, opens the door for more folks to step into this dance and gain influence and power. However, in the meantime, with El Mayo in jail, Mayo Flaco has really consolidated his position, even attempting to rebrand the La Maíza faction into the El Mayito Flaco faction. So if you are following along with this online, you might see either La Maíza or the El Mayito Flaco, faction. They might be used interchangeably because they're technically the same group. Of course, within the Sinaloa Cartel structure, you have the different plaza heads and who controls each plaza. And each plaza is basically a zone or an area that the cartel controls, which facilitates various parts of cartel operations. Each plaza is unique, and some are more powerful and influential than others. Some of the more important and influential plazas are the Culiacan Plaza, which is a major command and logistics hub, previously controlled by El Nini, then led by El Gavilan, and now someone else is leading it, and it's gone through some rather tumultuous changes in management recently. This is a pretty typical theme in terms of the plaza heads. A lot of these guys tend to either get killed or arrested or just generally disappeared. And so it's most of the plaza heads, we don't actually know who they are. They have a nickname assigned to them, but and they tend to change hands pretty quickly. The Nogales Plaza, which is a key border smuggling point, has also seen a recent change in management following the arrest of the plaza chief, Juan Carlos Morgan Huerta, nicknamed Cacayo. The Tijuana Plaza, for similar reasons, is still under, as far as I can tell, Aquiles and La Rena. And the Ciudad Juarez Plaza, which has been one of the bloodiest plaza, is still under Sinaloa control, at least partially. Other key people to know, and these are mostly La Maíza folks here, you have El Comanche, who's responsible for Flaco's security based out of Culiacan, alongside McLean. Now, all of this action and drama could not have come at a worse time for the Sinaloa Cartel, and it has overall a growing list of enemies, rivals, and other kinds of threats that are trying to eat away at the fringes. Of course, the biggest and most deadly threat to the Sinaloa Cartel is CJNG, or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. We've briefly brushed over them in the Mexican overview video, so check that out, but I'll definitely be circling back in a later video to do a more in-depth dive just like this video on them, so stay tuned for that. Bottom line though is that they're one of the largest and most sophisticated cartels in all of Mexico, and they're potentially a mortal threat to the Sinaloa Cartel, especially at a time whenever the whole cartel is actively fighting against itself. Of course, you have to layer on the Mexican federal government and the United States. The U.S. just designated both factions of the Sinaloa Cartel as foreign terrorist organization, which unlocks a significant amount of resources and legal authorities by the United States for both law enforcement and the military to go after these factions, as well as the CJNG, which was also included in that FTO list. As a result, the clock is now ticking on the Mexican government to produce some sort of results, and to show that they're taking this matter seriously. Whether those are self-generated actions like high-level arrests or raids on different kinds of facilities. There are opportunities aplenty here with the Sinaloa Cartel, with just to play La Maíza and Los Chapitos against each other by incentivizing arrests and forcing people to betray each other and looking the other way whenever one side hits the other. While the Sinaloa Cartel has a long list of enemies, they also do have some allies, however this list is shrinking. For the example, the Sinaloa Cartel has historically been allied to a large network of smaller cartels that provide different kinds of services or strengths that augment the Sinaloa Cartel. However, a lot of these smaller cartels have either been absorbed into the Sinaloa Cartel or have gone defunct. They've also historically worked with different Mexican officials through corruption schemes. However, again, with the FTO designation and the increased attention from the United States and the increased political pressure from the Mexican government, corruption on both sides of the border, whether that's corruption among U.S. officials with the Sinaloa Cartel or among Mexican officials, is probably going to be more risky for Sinaloa. Whether that's bribing U.S. law enforcement to look the other way or pushing a local Mexican mayor to push local law enforcement in a particular direction, this will all become much more difficult and high risk. And with all of that, let's quickly move to the military domain. The Sinaloa Cartel has a sophisticated level of capabilities. However, with conflict comes a general level of degradation through attrition. This list of capabilities is going to sound familiar for anybody that watched that previous Mexico video. The Sinaloa Cartel has a wide variety and assortment of small arms. It's a pretty eclectic collection, largely collected and smuggled from the United States. They also have a collection of heavy weapons to include heavy machine guns and anti-material rifles. They're also using drones in a similar fashion to what we've seen out of, as an example, Ukraine. They're also using FPV drones in a very similar fashion to what we've seen, for example, with Ukraine, where FPV drones carry some sort of an explosive, whether that's a grenade or a mortar round. They fly over an enemy position, and then they drop that round on their head. Notably, though, Los Chapitos has been using planes used for smuggling purposes for the purposes of dropping bombs on La Maiza targets. In fact, here's some footage of the Mexican Air Force intercepting that plane. And yes, those are propeller planes that the Mexican government is using to intercept. We've already talked about that, but to be honest, it's kind of cool watching this footage and actually seeing them used in a combat scenario. You just don't get to see that all the time. Both factions have armored vehicles, and these can be outfitted with heavy machine guns as well. However, pickup trucks are really the more common and typical means of transportation, especially for fighters. Both factions, of course, are in active conflicts not only with each other, but other cartels. For example, in Baja California and in central Mexico, both La Maiza and Los Chapitos are actively engaged against each other in armed combat. However, throughout the northern interior of Mexico, they're also fighting against CJNG, which has picked up its operations the past several years to take Sinaloa's place as the largest cartel in Mexico. Also across the border from Texas, La Maiza is engaged in some fighting against the Juarez cartel. Economically, the Sinaloa Cartel has gone through various evolutions, and they're certainly not unwilling to make another evolution if needed again. For example, just about every cartel that hails from the Guadalajara Cartel can claim in some sort of fashion that they originally started off by producing and smuggling marijuana. However, in the 1980s, cocaine became the bigger market driver, and that's how the Guadalajara Cartel began to leapfrog the Colombian cartels in terms of power. That's also thanks to the United States and Colombian government targeting Colombian cartels in force throughout the 80s as well. But I digress. In recent years, though, fentanyl has become a much more economical product to sell alongside its other products or to really add into its current product list. Fentanyl is a legally used opioid, mostly used in tiny doses for either sedation or pain reduction. However, it's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and even smaller doses can be lethal. This is why a lot of folks who end up getting some sort of surgery and end up getting prescribed pain medication have some sort of withdrawals whenever they're coming off the pain meds or end up addicted to opioids or even fentanyl. Some of those legally prescribed pain medications included fentanyl in the ingredients. So when the prescription is up and the addiction is there, they keep on looking. And that's where lower level sellers tied to the Sinaloan cartel as well as other cartels come in and start selling that product to those individuals, and that's how they make money. That's just an example of one of the types of clientele that the Sinaloan cartel placates to. Overall, the Sinaloa cartel sells anywhere that it can, but mostly to US-based customers. Atlanta, Chicago, and Tucson are some of Sinaloa's largest logistics hubs within the United States. In fact, things have been very busy in Chicago for Sinaloa. They have been so busy that El Chapo Guzman was named Chicago's public enemy number 1, joining only Al Capone, despite El Chapo having never stepped foot inside Chicago. To get the product from Mexico to the U.S., Sinaloa uses just about everything at their disposal. This whole process was previously overseen by El Mayo's son, Vicente Zambada Niebla. He would use 747s, submarines, container ships, speedboats, fishing boats, buses, trains, trailers, you name it. Every mode of transportation they use. In 2005, the DEA's interception rate was about 1% of what was completely flowing across U.S. borders. That at least was absolutely abysmal. However, even today, it's still a massive challenge. What's also interesting and kind of counter to the public narrative about this cartel and about the war on drugs in general is that U.S. citizens made up about 80% of the population of those caught moving fentanyl to U.S. ports of entry from 2019 to 2024. As much as politically the U.S. tries to offload blame for the drug crisis to Mexico or Mexicans, there's plenty of responsibility within the United States and within Americans. Whether, again, it's allowing guns to make their way south of the border into the hands of drug cartels, and we're going to talk about more in detail on how that's happening in a second, but also just the clientele being here in the United States, but also facilitating the drug trade at all. And this isn't just speculation, too. A leak in 2012 showed belief between Mexican diplomatic staff that U.S. officials were assisting the Sinaloa cartel smuggling drugs into the United States. Moreover, they were protecting the cartel while attacking rivals to lower violence across the border. All of this came from statements from the former spokesman of the state of Chihuahua. Of course, you also have Operation Fast and Furious, which is a very famous kind of operation from 2005 to 2011, where U.S. firearms dealers sold weapons to illegal buyers, purchasing weapons on behalf of cartels. This is all not good. Other parts of the Sinaloa Cartel's legal business portfolio include extortion, kidnappings, hacking, and human trafficking. Now, this generates, as you can probably imagine, a lot of money, millions and hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And to do this, they need to get creative to launder this money. And they mostly work through British Bank, HSBC, as well as a ton of U.S. banks. And to do this, they basically deposit small amounts less than $10,000 into accounts held all across the country across multiple different types of banks. By regulation, this avoids the risk of being reported under the Bank Secrecy Act. They can still be caught doing this, however, they just see that as part of doing business. With the volume that they're going through these banks to launder money through, it really doesn't seem to be that much of an impact. Whatever money can't get deposited into banks has to end up in Mexico somehow, though. One of the common methods that is used by the Sinaloa Cartel to move cash across the border is to really transfer the value of that cash in the United States to some sort of a product, like clothes or technology. Then taking that product across the border back into Mexico and selling it there. That turns that value into pesos, and those pesos are now clean. However, they do have some legal businesses to help assist in laundering money. For money to be laundered, you really need a large business either willing to help or somehow is involved in the scheme themselves. That's where legal businesses like clothing manufacturing, agriculture, or even tourism come in. Money is spent either on the commodity or service being produced, and that cash value is either transferred to that product and sold later within Mexico, or it's double booked on the accounting sheet, and thus that money becomes clean. It's a sophisticated network and process, but it works, at least for the most part. There have been multiple high-profile arrests around these schemes. However, the Sinaloa Cartel sees all of this as just the cost of doing business. However, this is all under much heavier risk, not only due to the FTO designation by the United States, but also the ongoing civil war between the two rival factions. Both sides have repeatedly attacked each other's money laundering infrastructure, and that not only hurts what remains of the Sinaloa Cartel moving forward once things cool down, if they cool down at all, but that also hurts their ability to continue operations as normal right now. Next, let's hit on the social aspect of the cartel, and this has some interesting variables to it. Of course, the cartel is majority made up of Mexican citizens. However, it does involve the help and cooperation of some U.S. citizens as well. For example, through smuggling, as we've already called out. The age range of members can be pretty varied. It's largely a younger organization with the average age somewhere in the mid-20s. However, they have been reported to recruit children as young as 10 within the organization. We'll hit on this later in the information section, but there are some localized support for the respective factions. For example, there are narco bands like Grupo Arriesgado, which favors La Maiza. It's not uncommon here for this group or other kinds of bands that support either faction to have public engagements where they have, all kinds of fanfare. They do autographs and have concerts. You could really summarize their level of support at best as being kind of like a corporation where there's some community outreach and, you might like a corporation or a brand just, kind of, but at worst it can be through terror, through instituting support through, you will follow this group or faction of the Sinaloa Cartel or you will be killed. So not really, there's not a lot of carrot and a whole lot of stick, and that's really what drives a lot of public support for either faction. In terms of infrastructure, we've already covered the types of businesses that both factions in the Sinaloa Cartel operate for the purposes of money laundering and security. They also operate underground tunnels and other types of support infrastructure which facilitate the movement of product and weapons, but can also facilitate the movement of personnel in a time of conflict. They also operate small airstrips in remote areas that can accommodate small aircraft for the purpose of smuggling. However, as I mentioned before, we've seen those aircraft used to drop bombs on rivals as well. Otherwise, this is a very distributed organization which exists far apart from each other and can move at high speed. Think of it as they operate in cells, not so much as like a firm control of territory. Logistically speaking, it's one of the most complex distributors in the world, moving product across multiple borders, across multiple continents and oceans, and funneling all that money and cash back to Mexico in a very clandestine fashion. It's objectively impressive, and for all the general disrespect that I see about the cartels, it's important to remember that cartel leadership and their logisticians, especially like El Mayo or El El Chapo, they would have been amongst the most effective executives if they went into legitimate business. Information-wise, things remain quite complex. A lot of communication happens through secret face-to-face conversations. However, they oftentimes can communicate remotely if they need to. It's a general preference, though, to have face-to-face communication, since that kind of lowers the risk of things being tracked, and that reduces the paper trail that investigators can use against them in court. Still, when using remote channels, social media has been the preferred method. Facebook, for example, is by and large the largest platform that's being used. And this is where everything from planning to recruitment can happen. There they tend to use coded words and to obfuscate, of course, what they're talking about. But of course, it's still happening in the open, and there's the risk that OSINT analysts, as well as law enforcement and other kinds of folks that are tracking them down, can really track what they're saying, and that can lead to arrests. Okay, so overall, that is a lot of information about the Sinaloa Cartel. As you can see, things are now not what they once were, and they're now more vulnerable than ever. This opens plenty of doors and opportunities for groups like CJNG and the Juarez Cartel, but also for the Mexican government and the United States to roll back areas of Sinaloa control. That said, the path forward will very likely continue to be very violent. The fighting between La Maíz and Los Chapitos has been particularly brutal, with lots of key leadership and infrastructure being lost in the process. Mind you, that's technically Sinaloa on Sinaloa action, with CJNG and Mexico not even having to lift a finger. That said, they are lifting their fingers and they are actively pressing Sinaloa back. So what is there to look forward to for the Sinaloa Cartel? Well, not much. El Chapo and El Mayo are in jail. Their sons are running the show, but as we've seen, some high-level arrests have happened, and they've come out of nowhere. And the clock is actively ticking on when the next arrest will happen, and the violence will continue to worsen. Since both factions are actively involved in the fentanyl trade, they're both active targets for the United States, especially with the high priority placed on fentanyl dealership and movement, at least in the near term. So that's all why the Sinaloa Cartel is falling apart. We'll come back in a later video and do a deeper dive on CJNG, because things are looking slightly different for them. Not necessarily more rosy, but just different. However, we will have to wait and see just how long this all lasts. Until then, I want to know what you think of all of this. Do you think that the Sinaloa Cartel will survive this decade? And if so, under which faction? Like this video if you found it helpful or informative. And for those of you that have been watching my past video, if you've made it this far in this video, I'm going to assume that you've watched some of my past videos. So you might be wondering where exactly my hair went. Don't worry, everything's fine. I was just balding and it was time to get rid of it. So no concern there, but that's just, I wanted to offer an explanation because I get visually that can be a bit of like a, bro, what just happened? So like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Subscribe for more analysis on topics just like this, as well as for that CJNG video. And with all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.